lady. You're 14. Well, what's your favorite Steely Dan album?
Welcome back to the Deep Discog Dive, the series where I go through an artist's full discography. I've been doing this series for about a year now, and it's been really fun to check out artists and bands that I might not have gotten to otherwise, and I really appreciate all of you who have joined me, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. As always, you're welcome to suggest artists that you'd like to see covered in the comments down below, though I'll also be putting the list of the artists who have been recommended to me in the description as well, so if you see them, don't feel like you need to comment again saying that you want to see them. I don't want anybody to think that I'm not listening to them. To start off DDD 2020, I thought I'd go in a slightly more retro direction and talk about 70s smooth rock studio wizards Steely Dan. The brainchild of two friends, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, they initially started playing in small clubs and groups around Bard College in New York, including a brief stint with Chevy Chase on the drums. They moved to New York City after college, where they got more jobs writing for movies or other artists, and eventually they were encouraged to start a band of their own. Mike, did you know that the name Steely Dan came from the William S. Burroughs novel Naked Lunch? Of course I know that. You and I now know a lot about Steely Dan. For this video, I'll be looking at their 9 main studio albums. Let's dive in. Damn, what a good-ass debut. More stylistically diverse than what I was expecting, though that may have to do with the fact that there were actual set band members alongside Becker and Fagen. It's as if they really wanted to try out a whole swath of different genres to see where their strengths really lied, and more often than not, their experiments ended up working out really well. Another solid one, once again they try on a bunch of different sonic hats, and some fit really well, and others are too big or they're too small, and then they have really bad hat hair for hours. My point is that some of these songs are phenomenal, and others are just okay. It's definitely more inconsistent than the last record was. This is also where Steely Dan started to hone their main lyrical approach, which is to describe the most unsavory people on earth with equal parts snark and cynicism with just a dash of sympathy. Tasty. It's here that Steely Dan broke ground with the jazzier stylings that would come to define their career, but they still had room to experiment like they did on Can't Buy a Thrill. Part of that exploration came from Becker and Fagen bringing in more studio musicians this time around, and you can really hear their impact in how fleshed out these arrangements are. Another darn good record. This one works as a good companion piece to Pretzel Logic in that it sees the band diving even further into jazz. I don't think it's as good as Pretzel, but you can't go wrong with it. If anything, this record is more interesting for what it represented for the band's history. Firstly, the band had toured the year before for the last time, and from here until 1980, Becker and Fagen would become proper studio lab rats. Second, the other members of the band who did want to tour had left, so everyone on this record who wasn't Becker or Fagen was a studio musician, including eventual Doobie Brothers singer Michael McDonald. Also, here's a bit of fun studio trivia. DBX had a line of noise reduction hardware that would reduce noise on analog recordings. It was a landmark achievement. It was a huge thing in audio production and recording. But the reason I bring it up is that apparently that same hardware wrecked the first mix of this album. You wouldn't know it from listening to it because I assume that they fixed it, but apparently Becker and Fagen wouldn't bring themselves to listen to this one for years. Before their final ascension into yacht rock fame, Steely Dan found their edge. This is without a doubt their roughest sounding record, much of it on purpose, and I can't say that it's their best, but I think it's their most fascinating and their most immediately gripping. Plus, Bernard Purdie on the drums for most of this thing. How are you gonna hate on the Purdie Shuffle? You can't. You can't unless you don't have a soul. The big yacht rock kahuna, Steely Dan diving big with the album that would make them rock royalty. And surprise, it's really good. It's really good. Honestly, this album could suck, and as long as Peg was on here, I would still dig it. This is also considered to be their best sounding record from an engineering standpoint, which is saying something when you're talking about a band like this. But I gotta say, I listened to an HD vinyl rip of this thing on YouTube off of my laptop speakers, and I didn't think it sounded that great at all, so checkmate, audiophiles. Becker and Fagen took a break after releasing Asia, and when they got back into the studio to record this, boy did it not go smoothly. Lawsuits, Becker's girlfriend dying of an overdose, Becker getting hit by a car, label issues, and an assistant engineer erasing an entire track by accident. With all that in mind, it's kind of surprising to find that this record's sound is more relaxed and spaced out than anything they've done so far. It's not a huge departure for them, especially lyrically, but it's definitely the slowest burn in their catalog. And again, the mixes are After Gaucho, the duo decided to take a much-needed break from recording together. Fagen released a studio album, Becker moved to Maui to become an avocado farmer, which is somehow both not what I expected and exactly what I expected. Eventually, the two reconvened for Fagen's second studio album, which Becker produced. They toured in support of that album, and then they toured again in support of a box set of their work. After which, they decided to get back into the studio and give us their first studio album in 20 years. Oof. I did not feel that one at all. This record feels like the worst kind of yacht rock. It's toothless and middling, and the lyrics too, they sound like caricatures of past Steely Dan songs. The mixes are still great, but yeah, I'm not gonna remember much about this one. But plenty of people do remember this album though, and that's because it won Album of the Year at the 2001 Grammys. Let's see what it was up against. Paul Simon's You're the One. I mean, Paul Simon's a legend, but that's not the Paul Simon record that people usually think of. Beck's Midnight Vultures, you know, fine album, but it's not everybody's cup of Beck tea. Eminem Marshall Mathers LP, no, I'm not even a huge Eminem fan, and even I know that that was, you know, a classic album. And I was hoping after Two Against Nature that we'd end this on a high note, but no, it's more of the same. It's probably the most downbeat record in their whole catalog, but it's not interesting in a way that like Gaucho was. It's the only record here that I could describe as being close to phoned in. Yeah, what a bummer. As far as the main Steely Dan discography goes, that's the end of it. Fagen put out 2 more studio albums, Becker put out 1 more, and the band toured every so often, including going to Coachella fairly recently. Unfortunately, Walter Becker passed away in 2017, and since then Donald Fagen has toured occasionally under the Steely Dan name. The band is apparently even touring this year with the Doobie Bros, so there's that. But even if they didn't end their discography on a high note, Steely Dan left behind a rich collection of albums, and I'm very glad that I got to them finally. I'd recommend these albums to any first-time Steely Dan listener, such as a 14-year-old girl.
Oh, what do you not know a lot about Steely Dan? Hey, hey, do all of you not know a lot about